Greetings, everyone. Today we're going to talk about railroading in Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I am both an author and I have been a dungeon master since I was in middle school for about 30 years. People say dungeon masters are not writers, they're not authors, and you're not telling a story. And so don't confuse those things, because what you'll end up doing is you'll end up railroading your players. You'll plan so much out ahead of time that the players will feel like they don't have a lot of freedom. And so this is probably the biggest advice I see online. I see people always saying, don't railroad, don't railroad, don't railroad. And what I'm here to say is sometimes I think it's good to have a railroad. My experience is that when I give my players too much freedom, when I just put a big map on the table and I say, okay, guys, go nuts, do whatever you want to do, go wherever you want to go, they kind of look at me with confusion. They look at me with a sense of, well, we don't really know, what to do or where to go. There's too many options. There's too many possibilities. Players are also not authors. They're also not storytellers. And so for a lot of players, it becomes very difficult for them. They need to have a lot of little prompts to kind of push the story along. And without those prompts, I think they end up getting lost and confused. And so the adventure just tends to kind of fizzle out as they just sort of wander around aimlessly, just killing monsters, collecting treasure, talking to villagers. There's a sense that it's kind of like a story that has no point to it. And I think that's where the railroad is useful. People get onto trains because they want to go to a certain location. Harry Potter, he gets on the Hogwarts Express and it takes him to Hogwarts where the adventure is. But you need that train to get him to where the adventure is. So I think that's really the way that I think dungeon masters should think about railroading. This is actually the approach that I take to storytelling as well. When I set out to write a book, I usually have a good idea of how I'm going to begin the story and then how I'm going to end the story. But I'm not often certain about how the players or how the characters in the story get to that part. And so as I'm writing the chapter, I try to surprise myself, not fully knowing every little detail of what's going to happen, to allow myself to be spontaneous and to be creative. And so I think it's the same thing with Dungeons and Dragons. When you're making a campaign, you have an end goal in mind and you have a starting point. But how the players get to that end goal, there's a million different ways that they can get there. If my players are really interested in doing something different in the game, then I would be totally on board with that. You give me a week and I can figure it out. And this is where I think that the players have the greatest amount of freedom, is at the end of a game session. The old joke is a guy has set up, $10,000 worth of Dwarven Forge to make this huge, epic city and castle and dungeon. And then the players are like, well, we don't really like this. We're going to leave town, If my players came to the table and I had this big adventure planned, and then they just decide because they don't want to be railroaded, they just say, hey, we don't want to do that dungeon. Well, then what I would tell them is, okay, well, I guess there's no game today. Come back next week when I change my plans, because dungeon masters need to be able to plan ahead. Now, I know that there's some DMs out there that are incredibly spontaneous, they're great at improvising, but I'm not really good at that. I'm not good at improv. I had a Greek mythology campaign that I just wrapped up, and in this campaign, they had a big battle against the Kraken in the city of Troy. Now, at the end of that, after they destroyed the Kraken, I wanted to wrap up the Greek myth campaign. And I suggested to them that they could go to Egypt. And they were on board with that. But I allowed them a lot of different options of how they could get there. So one of the ways is they could go onto a merchant galley. they could kind of hitch along with some other merchant sailors, and then they would have an adventure where they would have to deal with a big crew of shipmates. Another option was that they could get their ship. They had a smaller ship that was destroyed fighting the Kraken, and they said, well, what you could do is you could spend a few weeks and some money, and you could repair your ship, and then you could take your own ship to Egypt. The third option was, there was a rumor that the sun god Helios given to his son his flaming chariot. It's the chariot that pulls the sun across the sky. And that this flaming chariot had crashed somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains. And so, which was to the east of Troy, which is in what is today Turkey. And so they would have to take this journey across this rugged terrain to get to the Caucasus Mountains to find this chariot, which is essentially a flying chariot. But in order to get that flying chariot, they would have to defeat one of the Titans who has been imprisoned there by Zeus. So I had these different stories in my head, and actually I thought, they're probably going to take the flaming chariot route because that sounded kind of more interesting to me, but they didn't want to do that. They all unanimously decided, no, we're going to do the merchant galley. We want to get on the merchant galley. And so I said, okay, so that's what I did. So this is really where I think players have the greatest amount of freedom, is between adventures. But when they get to the table and I have things set up and I have things written out, there needs to be a little bit of railroading. The best dungeon masters and the best campaigns are the ones where there's a little bit of railroading and a little bit of sandboxing. But I do think it is a good idea to have a conclusion planned out that will be exciting and offer a satisfying ending to your adventure, to your story, and to your characters. So I hope you enjoyed this video and hearing some of my thoughts about dungeon mastering. And if you are interested in reading some books that are inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, then I highly recommend you pick up my books, Ages of Anya and The Princess of Anya. The Princess of Anya was actually inspired by a 4th edition D&D campaign. Now, like most people, I really wasn't a fan of 4th edition, but oddly enough for me, it was one of the most important games I ever played because it created the seed that turned into what I think is my best book. And so we didn't play the whole campaign. We just played the beginning of the adventure where there was a princess. My wife was playing a princess, and 2 of my other players, one of them was sent to assassinate my wife's character, and then the other player was sent to protect my wife's character. And so this was the setup. And the game ended when the princess with her protector had to flee from this huge tower. And they're going down the tower, and there's a spiraling staircase that they have to run down. And as they're running down the spiraling staircase, there's all these soldiers that are shooting arrows at her because they've been sent by her stepbrother Zabos. And so she's running down the stairs, her protector's fighting off people, soldiers are trying to kill her, and at the same time they're dodging arrows that are flying from the other side of the tower. We never really got to finish that story arc, but I really liked the setup, and I decided, hey, I'm going to turn this into a book because I like where this starts. And that became The Princess of Anya. There is overlap between, storytelling and gameplay. And when you create a perfect balance, that's when I think you have the best Dungeons and Dragons. If you enjoyed this video, click like, click subscribe, and please check out my author site, nickalamonos.com, where you can pick up some of the books in the Anya series. Thanks for watching.